Last week, the Canadian government released a fall economic statement and made several promises with respect to real estate in Canada and how they are going to make it more affordable for Canadians. But is what they promised really going to have an effect? Well, I'm going to touch on a whole bunch of things, including the new tax-free savings account that they've announced, as well as the tax on home flippers. That's kind of a tax on home flippers, but not really a tax on home flippers, and all the other things that go along with the fall financial statement. But before we get into it, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button. I thank each and every one of you who have already done so. And for those of you who haven't, well, if you're looking to thrive financially, well, this is the place for you. So go ahead and click that subscribe button. Okay, so a whole bunch of new rules, a whole bunch of things that went into effect previously, and things that are promised to go into effect in the new year came out in the fall financial statement. And there's some really interesting things here. And the question is, are they going to have an effect, and are they actually going to help Canadians? So rather than making this all fluffy and going into details and then getting political and talking about whether this is a good policy or bad policy, I'm just going to give you the straight goods and my reactions as I see them. So let's jump in and start first and foremost by taking a look at all the promises that are being made, including the ones that were passed in June, and then we'll move into the brand new ones that are coming up here. So first and foremost, there are several things that the Canadian government is doing to make housing more affordable, but is it actually going to make housing more affordable? And the reality is most of this is probably not going to have an effect. I'm going to get into the tax-free savings account that they announced at the very end of the video. I'm going to save that for last because I think many of you will be surprised at the logistics of this and whether or not it actually makes sense. And I'm not going to ruin the surprise for you. You're going to have to wait till the end of the video to see what I think of that. But let's talk about everything that they've put into place so far. So in June, Parliament passed several measures to create more affordable housing. The first was a 2-year ban on non-Canadians purchasing residential property in Canada. Now, this is obviously a good one politically. This makes a ton of sense for people who are really upset that a whole bunch of people from outside of Canada have come in and bought properties. But it also does a few things to limit the economy and limit growth in the economy, particularly people who buy properties in other countries for tourism. So people that live in tourist destinations like maybe Whistler or Canmore or different parts of Ontario that have high tourist rates, the cottage country in Ontario, these are going to be markets that are going to be adversely affected by this rule because it's going to prevent foreigners from being able to purchase properties in those tourist destinations, which will have a negative effect on the Canadian economy, especially if the Canadian dollar continues to deteriorate. Now, in places like Vancouver and places like Toronto, where they're trying to prevent a run-up in prices, this kind of makes sense, but my guess is, and there's still very little data on this, but my guess is the percentage of foreigners who are buying in Canada probably doesn't have as much of an impact on the Canadian real estate market as most people think. In fact, it's probably negligible because so few people are actually doing it, so few houses are being bought by foreigners compared to the total amount of supply that's available, that it's probably just a blip on the radar. Now, the second thing is a 1% annual underuse tax on the value of non-resident, non-Canadian owned residential property. Now, I think this is actually a good thing because if people are purchasing properties just for the sake of holding them in order to use them as a store of value and really not contributing anything to the economy, then absolutely, I think that they should be taxed in order to be able to do that. In fact, maybe 1% wasn't enough, but this actually makes a lot of sense, especially if people are just buying properties as a store of value in Canada. I like this one. I can't argue with this one. This actually makes sense. By the way, this is for foreign non-resident owners who are essentially just owning the properties for the sake of holding them as a store of value, similar to how they would gold. The next is the application of goods and services taxes to all assignment sales of newly constructed or substantially renovated housing effective May 7th, 2022. Now, this is essentially a speculator tax. So this is when somebody buys a property that hasn't been built, hasn't been renovated, and they hold it with the intention of it appreciating in value. And then just before they are to take possession of the property, they sell it to somebody else in hopes of realizing the gain in value that happened over the amount of time that they've had the contract to purchase the property. Now, this is speculation. This is a highly risky practice, and it's something that far too many Canadians participate in this. So I think that it's great that they've applied the goods and services tax to this. I think it is appropriate, especially if people are just trying to make an extra buck. The part I'm interested in is how they're going to actually enforce this, other than having the lawyers basically say, hey, on this particular property, you have sold it, you didn't live in it, so you now have to pay GST, and make the lawyers take responsibility for that. Now, lawyers don't typically want to take responsibility for anything more than they have to, so getting the lawyers to actually collect on this is going to be interesting. Now, these are the three things that were put into effect in June. Now, let's talk about the four things that are going to be put into effect, hopefully, in 2023. And when I say hopefully, I'm not necessarily saying I'm hopeful, but the federal government is hopeful that they will have these things in place for 2023. And I'm going to come back to the tax-free first home savings account at the very end because this is the one that I think is really interesting and that I really want to talk about. So first of all, they're going to double the first-time homebuyers tax credit, which would provide up to $1,500 in direct support to homebuyers starting in 2022. So to be clear, this is for first-time homebuyers, not homebuyers. And basically what this means is if you are a first-time buyer, you're basically getting a $1,500 rebate on your taxes in the form of a refund because you purchased that first property, which this helps. It probably pays for a little bit of legal fees, maybe some moving expenses. It's a nice thing, but at the end of the day, somebody who's purchasing a home, $750 extra compared to the previous year, isn't making housing significantly more affordable. It's making the transaction slightly more affordable, but the actual living process, paying the mortgage and the heating bills and the taxes and all of those things is not getting more affordable because they gave a $750 credit one time when you bought the property. Now, introducing a new refundable multi-generational home renovation tax credit, which would provide up to $7,500 in support for constructing a secondary suite for a family member who is a senior or an adult with disability starting January 1st, 2023. This one is interesting. This one, it's really good. I think that if somebody needs support, a family member needs support, somebody with a disability needs support, give them all the funding that you can possibly give them. I fully believe that this is a good idea. Now, one thing I do also like about this is going to encourage more family members living in the same property. Now, we all know that this is a difficult thing to comprehend. We all know that we spend the first 18 years of our life trying to get the heck out of our parents' house. We really want them moving back in with us. So I'm not sure what the uptake is going to be. But in the event that that is a possibility and that that's something that you want to do, I think getting a little bit of funding in order to basically take two households and amalgamate them into one is probably long-term a good thing for the Canadian real estate market, especially when you look at basically taking family density and increasing it so there's more properties available for others. And then this last one here before we get into the tax-free home savings account, this is to ensure that profits from flipping properties held for less than 12 months are fully taxed starting in 2023 with certain exceptions for unexpected life events. So in other words, what they're trying to do here is they are trying to make it so that a home flipper who is running a business of flipping homes, buying a home that is undesirable, improving it and then selling it is actually paying the taxes on that property. Instead of it being just a property that they're buying, they renovate it, they call it their personal residence and live in it for 6 months and then sell it with no capital gains taxes and no taxes whatsoever. That's what they're trying to prevent. Now, this is a double-edged sword. First and foremost, if somebody is operating a house flipping business, they should have to pay taxes. However, the slippery slope becomes on this that home flippers have a place in the economy. And while this doesn't go super far down the depths of basically penalizing home flippers, you have to understand that home flippers, they take properties that are undesirable, unsellable, places that nobody wants to live, and they improve them and make them places that are reasonable to live in, which actually adds housing to the economy. I use caution in painting home flippers with a negative brush and just trying to make it seem like they are the people that are responsible for the run up in housing prices, because that isn't necessarily the case. In fact, they're providing more supply, which over the long run will actually help housing prices as opposed to hurt them. Now, last but not least, let's talk about creating a new tax-free home savings account. So this gives prospective first-time homebuyers the ability to save up to $40,000 tax-free. It's like an RSP, contributions would be tax deductible, and withdrawals to purchase a first home, including investment income, would be non-taxable, like a TFSA. So you get tax-free in and tax-free out. The government expects that Canadians will be able to open and begin contributing to an account mid-2023. So this is really interesting because what this does is this takes the best of both worlds from an RSP and a TFSA and combines them into one. So this has never happened before. So you have to understand, first and foremost, if you are going to use this, it is highly beneficial. Because one, if I'm reading this correctly, and contributions are tax deductible, what that means is if you make a contribution, it is tax deductible in the exact same way that it would be if you contributed to an RSP. So you would, in theory, get a tax refund every single time you made a contribution to this new program. But then when you go to take the money out, it's also tax-free on the way out. Now, an RSP is tax-free on the way out if you're buying a home under the first-time homebuyers program, but the difference here is that this doesn't have to be paid back over a 15-year term. An RSP, on the other hand, if you take money out under the first-time homebuyers plan, you have to pay it back into your RSP over a 15-year period, or you get taxed on it. This is taking out the obligation to pay tax if you don't pay the money back into the account. So this now is effectively the single best way to save for a down payment if you're going to buy a home. Now, if you aren't going to buy a home, you can't take the money out tax-free, so it can be problematic in that way. But if owning a home is definitely 100% on the horizon for you, this is where you should be starting. This should be the first thing you are funding before you fund an RSP or a TFSA. And then what I would do is I would fund the RSP second. The reason why is because when you make those contributions to your RSP, you're again going to get that tax return, that tax refund, and that's going to grow your savings even more. And then third, I would use the TFSA for the purposes of buying a home. Now, if you aren't sure you're going to buy a home, I'd start with the TFSA because it gives you the ability to grow the funds tax-free without the obligation to buy a home in order to get the money out. But this is all really, really interesting. And I think the federal government did this right. They did, in this case, create the single best investment vehicle for buying a first-time home that you could possibly have ever in the history of Canada. And by the way, this is way better than their scheme that failed miserably, where they'd give you an extra 5% or an extra 10% down and become your partner in the property. This gives you a significantly better opportunity to own the home, own it by yourself, grow the money tax-free, and get additional funds via tax rebates for making contributions to the tax-free home savings account. So I have to give them credit where credit is due on this one. This one makes a ton of sense. I would like to see them do a whole bunch more to make housing more affordable once you have it. I know energy bills are going to go through the roof this winter. One of our condo complexes that we have went from an $8,000 a year natural gas bill to a $15,000 a year natural gas bill over the last 12 months. And that is probably going to be where people get hit the hardest, is on their energy costs this winter. So I'd like to see more in the way of making owning a home more affordable, especially with rising interest rates. But as far as being able to buy a home, if you're in the market in the next 5 to 10 years, this is definitely the tool and the product for you. The tax-free home savings account, when it becomes available, get your money in there as fast as you can. Take the money out of your tax-free savings account, stuff it in there, and use that as your vehicle for growing your down payment, because it is by far second to none when it comes to creating a savings. Oh, and one last thing, if you are looking at getting into the real estate market, our Homebuyer Masterclass is for you. It will make you one of the most well-informed buyers in the market. It will give you all the tools that you need in order to build the team that you need to make the best buying decisions possible. And it'll also explain a whole bunch of other things, like how to use that tax-free home savings account when they become available. So go to homebuyermasterclass.ca in order to get involved in that. If you found this video useful, do me that favor, hit that subscribe button, check out this video on the current market right now, and we'll see you on the very next one. Cheers.